Welcome back, Gadgeteers. Today I want to talk about an op-ed piece that was in Computer World that I found very interesting. This was an article written by Stephen J. Von Nichols, and it basically reflects his opinion on the future of Microsoft Windows being a desktop as a service, as he calls it, DaaS as we know it, D-A-A-S, and we'll go over that article. Before I get started, let me ask you this question, and I want you to think about it while we're going through our discussion here. If you had to, would you be willing to pay a monthly fee for Microsoft Windows? Now, initially, I think you would probably react much in the way I would. Absolutely not. I would never pay for that. But in reality, think about all the software that's become software as a service, also known as SaaS. All of the Adobe products, which was huge, all the professional Creative Cloud products. Before, you could just buy a version of the software just like anything else, and you were up and running, and you could do whatever you wanted. You could use it for 10 years if you wanted to. But now, of course, you have to pay a monthly fee, and with Adobe, it's somewhat horrifying in my opinion, because even though I can get the academic rate, it's still not the greatest deal, and I unfortunately, just like everybody else, have to sign a 2-year agreement, which I'm very loath to do, because you never really know what position you're going to be in 2 years down the road, and whether or not you're going to want to pay $20 or $30 or $40 or $50 a month for a piece of software, or collectively the Creative Cloud, which you can get access to all the applications. Another one, Microsoft Office. Before, you could just buy the version you wanted and you were up and running. Now, many of you won't remember that, and unless you're getting a version of Microsoft Office usually through your employer, most people don't pay for it. Some do if they're a student. You can get a student version, or the institution that you're getting your education from might provide you with Microsoft Office. So in the case of one of the institutions that I teach at, students get 10 licenses of Microsoft Office, or 10 installations. The problem, of course, is once you stop going to school there, after that calendar year, your license expires. Now, I did buy myself a personal license, and this was before the institution I was working for would pay for it. And I got a pretty good deal. I think it was something like $70 for a year. I used Office quite a lot, and after a time, of course, after a year came, it expired. And I thought, is Office important enough for me to actually start paying for it? And the answer was no, so I decided I would no longer use it, and I would just use OpenOffice, and I would be absolutely fine. Well, actually, I'm using LibreOffice, I should say, to be correct. But anyway, so I'm using LibreOffice, and I've kind of eschewed using Office or buying any software that requires a fee. So we're getting back around to that, would you pay for Microsoft Windows if you had to? Now, if you're a business client of Microsoft and using Windows, I really don't see much of a way around that particular problem. The other thing, if you are a gamer, would you be willing to discontinue using Microsoft Windows if you had to pay, say, a $20 a month fee? And how, if they decide to do that, would that process be enacted? And we're going to talk about that. But before we do, I want to show you the article that I thought was somewhat irresponsible by Von Nichols. Opinion, it is an opinion article, titled, "With DaaS Windows Coming, Say Goodbye to Your PC as You Know It." So basically in this article, what he's saying is the desktop as a service that's coming from Windows 10 is essentially going to require you to rent it by the month. And he points out DaaS for Windows isn't new. Citrix and VMware are also doing it as well, which is true. Microsoft themselves are doing it. Like we talked about, Adobe is doing it. Many companies do it, and I'm actually surprised that you can still buy the products that you can for Mac OS. For example, Final Cut Pro 10, I don't use others. I don't know if Pro Logic you can do that, but you can buy Final Cut Pro 10 for $300 and then you never pay anything else. I'm not sure how long that's going to last. It makes me a little bit nervous with this change here. According to the author, you'll no longer be in charge of your Windows PC. Instead, it will be automatically provisioned and patched for you by Microsoft without your control. And of course, he says, unless you've been under a rock, IT departments have not been happy with Microsoft's twice yearly major upgrades to Windows 10. And I agree. Now, what I found interesting was his comment here. These aren't upgrades or updates. They're service patches. So you're already using Windows 10 as a service. Now, Microsoft has so much as admitted this. There will not be another version of Windows. This is it. This is the last version you're going to use, and it is actually a service. And that's why we're seeing many of the controls and the functions that are built into Windows actually being put in there. Some, of course, monitor how you use Windows and so on. So if you did get a copy of Windows for free, in some ways you're trading information for the service, much as we do with the free Android on our phones or the free iOS on our iPhones and so on and so forth. Some may argue it's not really free because you have to buy the hardware, but in reality, it actually is. At least Android is. iOS, on the other hand, of course, you don't have to pay for it and you always get updates, but in some ways you do pay because you're buying the hardware. So I think that Apple has a little bit different strategy right now anyway, and I don't suspect anytime soon that they're going to be charging on top of buying an iPhone for iOS updates. I can't imagine that happening. Most people do agree that if you're going to buy a piece of hardware like a phone, at least with Android and iPhone, you do expect regular updates or security updates for some time, and I think that's reasonable. Of course, if you want to use Microsoft Windows, you're basically saying, I agree to this service. It's not necessarily that you're agreeing to use the operating system anymore, which is ominous. But let's go on. Windows patching was always chancy, but with Windows 10, you're more likely to have trouble when you patch than you are to avoid problems. And isn't that a heck of a note? Now here I actually tend to disagree with the author. I don't think the patching is as bad as he says it is. I have had problems to be sure, but I also was able to roll back, and as a matter of fact, I had the assistance of some of you here in helping me roll back my Windows installation. I went from a Windows 10 upgrade back to a previous version of Windows 10 and all was well. I think that they have had their share of problems, and I think as the complexity of hardware and software and management of software grows, you're going to see more problems surface with our hardware, but for the most part, companies are responsive. I say for the most part, in fixing the problem. Do you want to pay good money to let Microsoft maintain your desktops for you? That's what I thought. Nonetheless, DaaS is coming. Microsoft has been getting away from the old style desktop model for years now. By 2021, I expect the managed desktop to be to traditional Windows what Office 365 is to Office today, the wave of the future. Or maybe Tsunami, depending on your perspective. He's not happy with the development, the author goes on to say. And he does point out that in some ways, Microsoft's trying to return us to that old centralized control model that we thought we were freed from with the small computer, microcomputer, which became the personal computer and eventually laptops and so on and so forth, and tablets and whatever. Well, unfortunately, in that way, he's right. But why is he raising the specter that all Windows computers are essentially by 2021 going to be a for-fee desktop as a service? Well, let's look at an actual more objective article about the desktop as a service concept, and it actually came from ZDNet. Now, there are several articles like this out there that you can find. This one was actually pretty representative of most of the articles that I found, and it was more of a nature of reporting. Opinions are fine. Everybody's entitled to their opinions, but we're going to get into why I think the previous article was irresponsible. So, Microsoft's got a new plan for managing Windows 10 devices for a monthly fee. Microsoft's putting together a service aimed to take the pain out of procuring, provisioning, and managing Windows 10 desktops, currently calling it the Microsoft Managed Desktop. We've been talking about desktop as a service, but that's kind of a general term for the specific version of that, which Microsoft is terming the Microsoft Managed Desktop. The author goes on to say, basically the Microsoft version of DaaS. It will provide customers the ability to lease a Windows 10 device that's automatically provisioned for them and have the operating system kept up to date, and more for a single monthly fee. What differentiates the Microsoft version of desktop as a service from what many companies already offer that particular service as is the Windows 10 updating component. Now, the issue here is that essentially Microsoft has been doing the twice yearly feature updates, and many have been having a problem with that. And of course, again, as I mentioned before, this is what we call the Windows as a service. A strategy that Microsoft's focusing on is to essentially look at predictability, which makes perfect sense, not just in terms of spending, but also updates and support. So essentially, if you get smaller updates more frequently and it's all managed by Microsoft for one low price, it's going to be a boon for corporations, government, companies, and so on. Talking with my son who works for the state of Michigan, the government already does use essentially a Microsoft service, but they pretty much do it themselves. In other words, they have servers that run updates and they manage all of their systems on their own. So since they're such a big organization, they're not very likely to need the new desktop as a service concept. So who would want to use that? Although this article doesn't mention it specifically, in another article I was reading, they were saying that Microsoft is really focusing on the 99 and under computers running Microsoft Windows 10 in offices. And that makes some sense to me because if you think about it, a larger organization is more likely to be using their own inside infrastructure for IT, including personnel. So they're more likely to be managing their systems on their own. Now, smaller organizations are less likely, and they could use the added help. If you were a small business, you could find yourself in a gray area. So it's possible you might be using home licenses and actually using them for your computing needs. But some businesses, of course, are going to need that corporate or enterprise license, and they would fall into that area where they could make use of the desktop as a service concept that Microsoft's pushing for. So why I say the previous author was irresponsible in his opinion is because he makes it sound like the desktop as a service concept that Microsoft is working on is going to take over all of Windows, not just the corporate or business community or government, but also the personal user. And for right now, I don't see that as a likelihood. You might ask yourself, why the push to get desktop as a service ready by 2020? Well, that's actually a very good question. Mainly because the Windows 7 Enterprise licensing is going to expire. Not the licensing so much, but the updates. So there will be no more security updates for Windows 7 in 2021. So if you're an enterprise environment and you're using Windows 7, you're going to have to migrate to something else. You won't be able at that point, is my thinking, or possibly it could be a competing strategy, but I doubt it. You won't be able to buy Windows 10 licenses. I'm thinking you would now have to buy desktop as a service licensing. So essentially you would be tied into paying a monthly rate, unless of course you're willing to use home, which isn't likely at all. I can't imagine that in a corporate environment. It would have to be a fairly small business to be able to get by with Windows Home. So at least initially, even though this original opinion piece makes it sound like FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt, you have to go out and you're going to have to subscribe to this desktop as a service and pay a monthly fee in order to use Windows. I think it's more of a business rollout, but the possibility of it being in the future a personal consumer use is always there. Now, how would you do that if you were Microsoft? Well, I thought about that. Think about how they did it with Microsoft Office. It would be very much the same. Now, we're not going to have a new version of Windows, right? We're going to be on Windows 10, but it is a service and it does have updates that are required. So my thinking is on new PCs, they would do very much like you've seen with antivirus software, where you get a PC and it's already bundled with antivirus software. And after 3 months or 6 months, or sometimes if you're really lucky, a year, you would begin paying a monthly rate, or they would simply turn off the antivirus software, which is fine. I always just uninstall it and use the Microsoft antivirus anyway. Depends on what you want to do, but that's what I do. I can imagine where you buy a PC and you'll see on the sticker 1 year of Windows 10 service free, or whatever they want to call it, Microsoft Desktop service, whatever. And so basically you get it free for a year. After that, your desktop will expire and it'll either go to a very basic use like it does now. So if you install Windows 10 and you don't put in a code, a key code, security code, you can still use Windows 10, but it's definitely much more simple. There's a lot less features that you can use and things that you can do. Or like with Microsoft Office, they'll just disable Windows 10 on your desktop altogether until you go and purchase your service support plan. And they could very well do what Adobe's doing, where they say, okay, basically we're going to make you use this particular software for at least 2 years. What you would have to do then, if you can imagine, is purchase a license of some sort, much like Adobe, which is more access than licensing. And you would have to pay a monthly rate, and it's possible you could have to agree to a term like 2 years. And if you don't like that, then all you have to do is put a different operating system on your computer or stop using Windows altogether. And if that's the case, then I think that, yes, practically all users would end up paying that price and using Windows. I'm thinking of gamers, basic users who might or might not, but probably more likely, are already paying for Office. They're not going to give up on Microsoft Office. They're already paying a fee for that. They're probably willing to pay an annual fee or a monthly fee for access to Microsoft Windows as well. Small businesses, it's what they have in their system. And I'm thinking of some of the businesses that I've done work with before. I can think of one, a restaurant that had about 10 systems in there. And they have Microsoft Home on most of their systems, or Windows 10 Professional. And of course, their thinking is, hey, we're already using this. In some cases, they're running their point of sale systems on top of Windows 10. They can't change. They have to have Windows 10. So yes, they would do the mandatory licensing or monthly rate for the desktop as a service. It's no different than them deciding to do that for any other software. Of course they're going to do it. What choice do they have? So I really think it's going to be a gradual thing. So on the one hand, I feel like Von Nichols is basically creating this fear and uncertainty and freaking people out to some extent, making them think, hey, I think I might lose access to Windows 10. What am I going to do? And if I did have to pay for it, would I? In the long term, if you're a home user, a consumer, it's not bad to start thinking about that. Are the tools and the software that I use requiring me to have Windows 10? If they are, then you may end up having to enter into some agreement with Microsoft to have access to Windows 10. From a business standpoint, that's going to come sooner rather than later, because Microsoft wants to get itself positioned as best they can before the expiration of the security updates for Windows 7. That makes sense to me. So here, I think we're talking about what corporations are going to have to do. If a company does have to end up paying for Windows 10, I think it's fair to say that they'll pass the cost on to the users, or their consumers, if you will, which is us. And that's why I ask, what will you do? From me, on a personal standpoint, and now we kind of venture into opinion, yeah, well, I have the same attitude about Adobe Creative Cloud software and Microsoft Office. If my organization is willing to pay for the license, I'm willing to use it. If my organization requires me to know and understand Windows 10 and use it, and I'm going to be teaching courses in it, then they're going to have to pay for the license for me. Otherwise, I'm going to do what I've been doing. I'll switch to my desktop here. And of course, that's continue to use Linux. I think that if Microsoft does this, we would see a small increase in the Linux desktop growth. But not very much, maybe 2 or 3 more percent, but not a whole lot. We actually might see a greater increase in users of Mac OS and Apple products, I think, than we would see a greater increase in Linux. But since Linux is only running 1.5–2% of the desktop market, it's possible that we could double that, or, possibly triple it. We might get to 5 or 6%. But that's why I use Linux right now, and you can see that most of the software that I use is already replaceable for me. So again, I use LibreOffice. I have Steam in some of my games here now. I'm not a major gamer, so I wouldn't need to worry about Windows. I could see where a gamer would say yes. If it was, say, $20 a month, would you find that acceptable as a gamer? I think you would, because you want to play those games. Some of them you already pay monthly fees for. It's kind of the cost of doing business, or in this case, the cost of having fun. So if you want to keep having fun, you're probably going to pay that little bit extra that you have to pay to do what it is you want to do. I really feel like all the software I need is available on my Linux system, and I know that it's free, and I know that I will never have to pay for it. And that includes all the stuff that I've already skipped: Microsoft Office, Adobe Creative Cloud. Now, the organization I work for, I did have to teach some courses in some of the Adobe Creative Cloud software, and I asked if I could get a license to use at home since they have a site license, and the answer was no. The licensing is very, very strict. So unfortunately, I could only use Creative Cloud software when I was at work, so I'd have to go to work to do all of my grading, when I would say 70% of most of the courses that I teach are online using Blackboard, which is an online teaching tool, and all the software that I need usually I can get access to from home, so I can do all of my grading of student projects and student work from home. But that is not the case with Creative Cloud. I will still teach it, but I won't necessarily pay for it for myself. I'm already 90% Linux. I do some Mac OS stuff, and I do very seldomly do Windows. Now, since I've had this Dell Ryzen, which I bought last, I want to say late November, early December, I've only actually logged into Windows maybe twice. So I don't feel I need Windows for anything. Everything I have is available on Linux. So that might be a solution you might think about. It all depends what you want to do. Anyway, don't freak out and think Microsoft Windows is going to be taken away from you anytime soon. If you're a consumer, if you're a business user or a corporation or small government, you might be ending up paying for software, well, I should say desktop as a service, just as you did with Microsoft Office. Will it kill the budget? Probably not. But it won't be pleasant, and you'll be tied to it. That's the downside. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe. If you really like it, think about sharing the video. It really helps me out. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/FastGadgets.